religious people these days, there are few real church men and church women. George Brick was a real churchman. He was a man of deep and abiding faith who lived out his faith in his daily life, and he will be truly missed. But Jean and Lynn and Paul and Nancy and Don and Carol and Kevin and Sister Evelyn and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and nieces and nephews and fellow church members and friends and neighbors and customers and all who knew George and grieve at his passing, we need only ask the question posed by Psalm 15. O Lord, who may abide in your tent, and who may dwell on your holy hill? And then read the psalmist's answer to know that George Brick has gone home to the Lord. George Brick has gone home to the place prepared for him from the beginning of time. And may we who would rejoice in the triumph of all the saints profit by their good example. Amen. I'm very pleased to have two colleagues in ministry with me today, and also in a moment we'll invite two of George's granddaughters to come forward. But first, let me introduce you to the Reverend Susan Flicker, a niece and a United Methodist minister.
Thank you, Pastor Peter, for this opportunity to be here. Thank you, Uncle George, who knew the master planner, and the master planner created him to be quite a planner himself. I want to share with you a particularly meaningful verse to me when I think about Uncle George. In the midst of the Gospel of Matthew, we read the parable of the talents. And hidden in and around all this talk about talents and multiplying them, and Uncle George certainly knew how to do that, is what I consider a very important verse. It says, the master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." I think that pretty much sums up Uncle George's life. What do you think? He was on a journey. And as you heard Pastor Peter relate his life, he went from one level to the next, planning carefully, honoring the Lord through it all, and he was on a journey. He and I got to share a particular journey. He did not get to be the pastor, and when I did, we went on this incredible 24-year journey so far. And when he was with me for my celebration of 20 years in ministry, he saw my stole alongside. It said, "Journey. Celebrate the journey." And wasn't that Uncle George? And in it has things like Jesus, family, mother, love, friends, faith, God, life, children, youth, fathers, hope, joy, grace. Celebrate the journey. And Uncle George certainly celebrated with everyone he ever met, in every circumstance there ever was. And there's a good thing sometimes about coming together as family. I learned a story I had never known. I've known Uncle George to call Aunt Jean brown eyes my entire life, and I never knew why. And I got to learn the story. There's always room in a family to learn, and Uncle George would call me up, and we'd have these long conversations, and he would have an idea, Pastor Peter, because he had asked me, and I shared with him my letters and my newsletters and my weekly bulletins and my weekly sermons, and he would call up and he'd say, now tell me how you're doing this. Okay, I have an idea. He would also say, now honey, and boy, you knew after that was coming something that maybe you didn't want to hear, but that you were going to want to listen to. And he said it in such gentle ways, didn't he? Yeah. I want you to know that we appreciate his affinity for everybody he ever met. But as family, we recognize our extraordinary blessing of having him as husband, brother, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, uncle, great-uncle. My own son is not here, but from a little boy, Uncle George had a big impact on his life, and he would always want to measure himself by Uncle George. And so every time they were together, they'd have to go back to back. Even when Scott only reached up to Uncle George's waist, they'd have to stand back to back. But that was a way of measuring against Uncle George in far greater ways. And Uncle George was extremely patient, as he was with all of us. I walked into the funeral home yesterday, and the video was playing, and a song was playing. And it stopped me dead in my tracks, because as I thought about what I would share beyond the Bible verse, the words of the song had come to my mind, and it was just an affirmation. When I think of Uncle George, one of the first things I think of is, don't let your praying knees get lazy. Because Uncle George was above all things a man of prayer. And loved like crazy. And he loved all of us like crazy. And I can hear him saying, just very nonchalantly, why sure, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And for him it was. So, thank you, Uncle George, and continue to pray in his behalf. Pray after his example. And those who are still around you, love him like crazy. And Uncle George will be honored.
My name is Paul Nye, proud to be a nephew of Uncle George. And when Pastor Peter originally invited me to participate today, I was humbled and I was honored. And I thought, where on earth do I start with talking about Uncle George or matters of faith? And I first thought back to being a child, and the first time I visited Uncle George at the Lawsville Center General Store. And walking in and being sure that Uncle George had achieved the apex, the supreme summit of being a terrific, successful businessman, because as you walked into the general store, on the left-hand side was a gigantic counter of penny candy. And as a kid, I was sure that if you could afford and provide penny candy, you must be a success. And along with that, he naturally offered me a nickel, which at that time got me 5 great things. As a kid, Uncle George often surprised all of us. I remember riding down the road one time with him, my brother John and myself, outside of Montrose, and he pulled the car over. He got out of the car. Now we're sitting in the back seat, and he didn't say anything. He pulled the car over, got out of the car, went to the trunk, opened the trunk, and got out a rifle. He closed the trunk, leveled his arm on the trunk for steadiness, and shot out across the meadow and shot a groundhog. Well, John and I were very confused and excited about that, and he explained that farmers didn't like groundhogs because those that had cattle and animals didn't like the holes that they that they provided, but Uncle George was certainly a person who had lots of surprises and lots of joy and could have been considered a success not just in business but in any part of his life. And so in thinking about today, I finally decided to talk about, just briefly, something that I thought Uncle George would like us to consider together. And I chose this text from the 12th chapter of Hebrews. Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings to us, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus Christ, the perfecter and pioneer of our faith. It was only about 9 days ago that I was privileged to be here to lead worship. And Jean and Nancy and some of you were here that particular day. And here at United Methodist Church in Tunkhannock, there are 2 worship services, about an hour and a half time between the worship services. So after the first service was over, we headed down to Bricks Market to do some shopping in between services. And as we pulled into Bricks Market, we saw this tent out in the parking lot, one of those sideless tents where you can see into it, and there were tables inside of it, and they were filled with clams and scallop and shrimp, and there was a gigantic sign there that said, "Seafood Sale Today." Now, as I had often been here for Bible studies, for church dinners, for preaching, for whatever, Uncle George and I had this kind of thing between us where I sort of guaranteed, in a tactful way, Pastor Peter, always in a tactful way, to work Bricks Market into the conversation. And so when I saw the seafood sign today, I was really tempted at the second worship service to just adjust it a little bit and maybe talk about fishers of men, and as part of that, announce that great seafood was available at Bricks Market after worship. But when I would preach or talk or lead Bible study or hymn sings here, and Uncle George would be aware, he'd get a big kick if I could just sort of tactfully work Bricks Market in it. And I'd say, "Uncle George, did I do okay?" And he'd say, "You betcha." Can't you hear Uncle George just saying, "You betcha"? He'd say, "Wow." Because Uncle George loved the fact that he could market in many different ways Bricks Market. He was a marketer at heart, among other things. And regarding Bricks Market, he was willing to advertise seafood or 3 cans of peas for $1 or a couple cents off at frozen turkeys near Thanksgiving. But what he really wanted to do was to market Bricks Market, not the individual items, so that when somebody thought of food, they'd think of Bricks Market as the answer to all of their needs. Well, when it came to matters of faith in God, Uncle George certainly saw God as the answer to all of his needs. Any of the situations he faced, any of the decisions he made, any of the questions that he regarded, any of the responsibilities that he accepted, he thought first of God. And what would God want done here? He talked, he lived his faith, and he pointed to God in all things. Think about it. When dealing with his Parkinson's disease, in some of the transitions that took place in his church life through the years, when the Walmart superstore came to town. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I said Walmart in front of the bricks, but it was quite a challenge. The death of his sister or his brother. At any and all times, in any and all challenges or decisions, Uncle George believed that God had the answer, that God had input and guidance and a will to be recognized in any situation. Peter, I mean no offense by this. Aunt Jean, Aunt Evie, family, I mean no offense by this. But I think Uncle George was one of God's chief marketing reps. You know what a marketing rep does? Calls, visits, puts the name and the brand out in front of people as often, as well, as consistently as possible. Every opportunity, seeking opportunities, making opportunities. Well, that's what Uncle George did regarding his faith, regarding his belief in his God. I mean, how many hours did Uncle George spend on the telephone? Making his phone calls, getting volunteers, talking about prayer needs, talking about the church, having some great ideas. He was out there in a faithful way, marketing what God would want and what he thought God would want, and putting it out in front of people to see and hear. Tyler Hospital, another example. When Uncle George was there, those times that he was there as a patient, the rumor is the chaplain took the week off when Uncle George was on that floor. Because he would evangelize. He wouldn't just evangelize the patients, he was evangelizing the doctors and the nurses and the staff and the family and the visitors. Because he had good news about God to share. And he really wanted people to think of God first. If it could include a request for prayer, if it could include an invitation to worship, if it could include some other specific, that's fine. But Uncle George was going to get God into the conversation. And what a wonderful God he had, and how blessed he was in any situation. I'm sure, as we've heard in his decisions as an employer, as a member of the board of Tyler, as a member of the school board, wherever he made decisions, Uncle George was asking, what would God have us do here? It wasn't just the bottom line of dollars or popularity. Because Uncle George was a real marketer, not just for Brick's Market, but for God and for what God had done through him and for him in Jesus Christ. The scripture I started by reading today said, "For we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses." That cloud of witnesses might be Uncle John, or my mother Mary. But I tell you what, there's one new witness that I think we can all be sure of. There's certainly one recent member of that cloud of witnesses, and his name is George Brick. And if God would ask him, George, did you put my will first? George, did you represent me to others every chance that you possibly got? Uncle George would look up with that patented George Brick gleam in his eye and that unbelievable, charming George Brick smile on his face. And he'd answer, "You betcha. You betcha." And I'd add as a postscript that as they closed that conversation, I think God would say to Uncle George, "By the way, we've decided to put you in charge of our heavenly roast beef and ham dinners." In conclusion, Hebrews told us, "Let us run with perseverance the race." And I think that Uncle George, as part of his legacy, as part of his role as a marketing rep, would want us to think about that. He'd be thrilled that we're here to celebrate our faith and his faith. He'd be thrilled to know that we were focused on faithful living and on the promises that God made and fulfilled through Jesus Christ. But you know what would thrill him just as much or more? If he believed and felt that because of him, we had paused to ask ourselves, now that he has run the race, now that we are still in that race, how will we take more seriously personally our role as marketers, as witnesses, as believers in this God that Uncle George worshiped and glorified and served? That would be a great part of his legacy, because that's what made him so special, his living the love. And I think Uncle George would be thrilled if we could each ask ourselves, even this very day, how can I more fully live and demonstrate that love that George Brick made so special? We thank God for the gift of Uncle George, and we thank God for the gift of his love. Let's share it. Amen.
Haley and Michelle.
Hi everyone, I'm Haley, and I just wanted to share with you a couple stories or memories I should say, of my grandfather that I hold dear to me. One is that growing up, my grandmother would pick us up at the bus from school and bring us back to their house. And when Grandpa would get home from work, he would go say hello to Grandma and then come in and say hi to Owen and I, my brother. And he would then proceed to chase us around the house, saying, "A rump, a rump, a rump," in his suit. He would chase us from the living room to the kitchen, and Grandma would usually say, "Get out of the kitchen." And we would be under tables, and he would go under the tables and chase us. Another story that I have is I did not get the George Brick math brain that we all know and love. Yeah, none of us really did. But he would pull out the change he had in his pocket from work and put it on the table and make me count it whatever way he wanted me to count it until I got it right, and make multiple amounts of change. And when I was done, he would always tell me what a good job I did and encourage me, and then help me with my homework, and we'd have to go eat dinner. But he was truly an inspiration to me as my grandfather, and I know we're all going to miss him very much. But sorry. I just yeah. Like everyone else knows also is, I know my mother wanted me to mention that he had that twinkle in his eye that we all know, and he always made us feel so loved as his grandchildren. I can probably say that for all of the grandchildren. But I believe that I can say this for all of us, that his memory will never be forgotten.
We'd like to thank everyone today for paying their respects to our grandfather. He would be so thrilled to know that many of his family and friends were here today in church just for him. Some of us more than others. He's happy we're here in church. I'm Michelle. I'm the oldest of his 7 grandchildren. We're the lucky 7, because if you are a Brick grandchild, you are certainly blessed. I am going to be 41 on Friday, and when I was born, my grandfather was only just a few years older than I am now. So that's a little bit of perspective. I've had a grandfather for a very long time. I actually Googled a few things before I sat down to write this, and I don't want to scare anyone because Grandpa wasn't really in the Google generation, but I remember a conversation I had with my father a long time ago. when my grandfather was planning on changing stuff at the store yet again, which he did all the time. If you worked for him or you knew him, you knew he was always changing or trying new things. And my dad told me he never knew of any other person like my grandfather who loved and embraced change, technology, or just trying different things. And for someone from his generation, that was certainly impressive, and that I should get used to it. So I have. So I would like to think Grandpa would love Google. If he could work a computer, he would have Googled everything. I started working for him at the age of 12. And what neither of us knew at that time, that this was setting up my destiny. The store, Bill, my girls, everything would go back to that moment, because I would not have had a husband who worked at the store. No one would plan that. Our grandfather certainly loved words and phrases. If you knew him, the "you betcha" was certainly him. I'm going to try to throw a few in here, if I can pull it together and read this. But it was stuff that he said to us all the time, and you'll know it if you hear it. Once when I was 7, he took me to the circus. George Brick, in his suit jacket and his wingtips, he had tried to get my mother and my grandmother to take them, and they were busy. My brother was an infant. My grandmother was working in the deli and said, "George, I can't take her. I'm working." So off we went. He took a friend and I. And we had a great time, and as we were leaving, he noticed that they were giving elephant rides off on the side. So like any 48-year-old grandfather, he climbed on an elephant with me in his suit jacket and his fancy shoes. And when you think about this, there was no safety restrictions, no helmets. This was just a man with an elephant and a rope, and here I am riding it around with my grandfather. And that is a tremendous memory. And tremendous was one of his words. He would say it all the time. As a grandfather of 7, he and Grandma have been tireless supporters of all of us. They've attended countless sporting events, band concerts, horse shows, birthday parties, graduations, weddings. They were even at the hospital when my daughters were both born. When I had my oldest daughter, Mara, he was regularly going to cardiac rehab, and he would go exercise, and then he would come and visit me. And he would bring along whoever else was exercising at cardiac rehab, because that would be practical to Grandpa, so why not bring who was ever there to come meet me and his great-grandchild. As you said, he was a man of spreading the word, so he would just bring people down the hall, come meet my family. It would seem strange to other people, but not to me, in a hospital gown breastfeeding with a strange man in my room, my father. Another story I want to share is about his commitment. We certainly need to talk about the store. Grandpa was committed to his family, his God, his church, his community, and the store. The store was his 4th child. And after 40 plus years, it's still managing to serve Tunkhannock, and it's the only locally owned supermarket. I had to get that in there too. It's still going strong with all our generations, and it's going to be there as long as we can keep it there. Grandpa lived and breathed the store. He couldn't have a family gathering without us discussing it, whether it was good, bad, or indifferent. He loved his employees. He loved his customers like family. Even after he retired, he showed up every day. He rearranged stuff. He had ideas. He cleaned. He was just the moral support of the whole store. He did not know how to not think about the store. In 1993, we had the storm of the century, or the blizzard of 93, and the governor had issued a state of emergency and shut down all the roads. My dad had tried to get to the store to plow it and was even chased by state policemen, told to stay home. You could not go anywhere. My grandfather called our house and asked if he came and picked me up, we could open the store with me and him and a few other employees that he was going to try to pick up on the way. He asked me if I was willing to go, and I said, "Grandpa, have you seen the news? Have you looked out the window? We cannot get there." And he laughed and said, "Wow," like he always does. And he said he'd see me soon, and sure enough, about an hour later, he and my Uncle Theron, who had driven from Montrose, came and tried to pick me up and tried to get the store open. That is serious commitment. For Tunkhannock, he wasn't trying to do it for us. He was doing it for the customers. He was worried about the employees that would not get paid that day. That's the kind of person he was. So, our grandpa loved sports, especially Penn State. He loved chocolate chip cookies. He loved fishing. He loved the Cardinals. He loved ketchup. He loved animals. He was a great man. He never raised his voice. He championed any new endeavor we might follow. And none of us would have ever attended college without his support or advice. He and our grandmother are true examples of perseverance, love, kindness, and loyalty. He made a tremendous contribution to his community and our lives. He gave more than he took. He touched more than he knew. I would like to finish with a quote from Abraham Lincoln. And in the end, it's not your years in your life, it's your life in your years. And he certainly embodied that. He had many great years, and he had lots of life in those years. And we would just like to say, Grandpa, all is well. He always would ask us if all is well, and then he would reply back, all is well. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you all. At the conclusion of the service, you are all invited and encouraged to come downstairs for a time of fellowship and refreshment. The ladies of the church have prepared a light lunch, and this will give you an opportunity to visit with one another and to share some more stories about how much George and Jean have meant to you over the years, have meant to all of us over the years. Because the interment will be done at the convenience of the family, we're going to do the prayer of consecration and commendation now, and the prayer of committal. The prayer of committal. So let us bow now for a word of prayer. O God, all that you have given us is yours. As first you gave George to us, so now we give him back to you. Receive George into the arms of your mercy. Raise him up with all your people. Receive us also and raise us into a new life. Help us so to love and to serve you in this world that we may enter into your joy in the world to come. And now, O God, into your hands we commend your servant, George Brick. Acknowledge, we humbly beseech you, a sheep of your own fold, a lamb of your own flock, a sinner of your own redeeming. Receive him into the arms of your mercy, into the blessed rest of everlasting peace, and into the glorious company of the saints of light. God of love, we thank you for all with which you have blessed us even to this day. For the gift of joy in days of health and strength, for the gifts of your abiding presence and promise in days of pain and grief. We praise you for home and friends and for our baptism and our place in your church with all who have faithfully lived and died. Above all else, we thank you for Jesus, who knew our griefs, who died our death, and who rose for our sake, and who lives and prays for us, and as he taught us, so now we pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. If you're able, I invite you to stand with me and join as we sing Onward Christian Soldiers, another of George's favorite hymns. We won't sing all of it. Let's just sing the first and the fourth and the fifth verses, 3 verses of number 575, Onward Christian Soldiers.